Well, hello, everyone. My name is Rep Buttle. I'm proud to serve as the moderator for today's conversation. We have a great lineup of speakers today, and we're going to hear from researchers and practitioners on the long-term unemployment crisis and what needs to be done to support this population in the wake of economic impact of COVID-19. First, we're going to hear some recorded remarks from Nancy Lamond, Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy Officer at Aarp. Following that, we're going to hear from Jean Setzfend, Senior Vice President of Programs at Aarp, who will have a fireside chat with Dave Altig, the Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. We're then going to have two panel discussions on potential solutions and strategies for the long-term unemployed. But first, I'm honored to introduce two amazing leaders and today's host for the conversation. Stuart Anderson is the Assistant Vice President and Director of the Center for Workforce and Economic Opportunity at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. In his role, he conducts research and works across the country to support the Federal Reserve and partner organizations' efforts in workforce development, labor market, and economic opportunities for low and moderate income workers. We'll also hear from Susan Weinstock, who's the Vice President of Financial Resilience Programming and is responsible for the overall strategic direction of Aarp's programs and education to improve the financial security of persons age 50 and older. Prior to Aarp, Susan worked at the U.S. Department of Treasury. With that, it's my pleasure to hand the conversation over to Stuart. Stuart, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. I want to welcome you all to the conversation today and say that on behalf of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and the Center for Workforce and Economic Opportunity, we're really happy that you're here today. Today, we're going to start focusing on a really important conversation and challenge in the labor market, the long-term unemployed. We all know and have heard about the significant challenges for employment that the pandemic has created and the effects that has had on different types of workers. Certainly the economy the overall unemployment rate has really improved since April 2020, when we were near 15% unemployment. But just recently, the most recent monthly unemployment report showed that about 4 million workers were long-term unemployed. Those are workers that have been unemployed and looking for work for over 26 weeks. As the economy continues to recover, we need to find ways to support these workers. And we know that long-term unemployment has become an increasingly and large portion of the unemployed, especially during recovery. Today, we're going to hear about those trends from a number of panels, and we're going to also start to explore some solutions. We're really happy to be here today and to start that conversation. I do want to say that as a research institution, we bring together different and diverse views. We hope that they're going to add to your thinking on challenges and services to the long-term unemployed and to other portions of the labor market. I do want to stress that they are the views of the speakers alone. They're not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta or the Federal Reserve System. But again, we do hope that you take something from the conversation today, and we're really excited that you're here. With that, I'm excited to turn it over to our close collaborator, Susan Weinstock, who's going to give just a bit more of an introduction as we get the program going. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Stuart, and welcome. And I want to thank you all for joining us today to discuss the important and timely topic of the long-term unemployed. I want to say how thrilled we've been to work with the Atlanta Federal Reserve to host this event and to tap on their incredible expertise. We plan on this being actually the first in a series of discussions with experts and policymakers about how we can support this population. And I just want to level set the conversation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics defines long-term unemployed as those who are unemployed for 27 weeks or longer and have actively sought employment during the past 4 weeks. The key here is actively sought employment. So if you are a discouraged worker who is no longer applying for jobs, but you've been out of work for 6 months or more, you are no longer counted in this number. So the number is even probably bigger than what we're talking about today. In June 2021, the number of long-term unemployed as measured by the BLS increased from May's 3.75 million to now 3.99 million, which means we think that more people are actually looking for work now and they're no longer, shall we say, discouraged the way they were previously. At least we hope so. We have a great lineup of experts who can tap into all this and look into the data give us potential solutions, and provide their wealth of knowledge to new and important insights. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Nancy Lamond. She is AARP's Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer, for opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I'm happy to join all of you virtually for today's important event looking at long-term unemployment in America. The latest jobs report highlights why AARP is so focused on this issue. In June, 55% of job seekers 55 and older reported being unemployed for more than 6 months. That's significantly higher than what their younger counterparts are experiencing, with 36% still looking for work after 6 months. And the average duration of unemployment for folks age 55 to 64 was just under 9 months, more than a month longer than those aged 35 to 44. This is a troubling trend that we've seen before. During and after the Great Recession, it took a lot longer for older Americans who lost their jobs to find new ones, sometimes twice as long as younger job seekers. Many ended up taking positions with lower pay, fewer hours, or reduced benefits. Some had to start over in a new field or different locations, and some gave up and dropped out of the workforce entirely. Today, in addition to older workers, pandemic job losses have disproportionately affected minority workers, women, and Americans without college degrees. To the extent that they remain unemployed for extended periods of time, this recent history tells us that the financial ramifications will be significant and long-lasting. We've convened this session today to shine a light on the problem and begin a conversation about solutions. From AARP's perspective, a significant hurdle facing older job seekers is age discrimination. In a survey of 40+ professionals conducted by WorkLabs, 75% said they experienced ageism in the hiring process. And we know that online ads and job postings can be targeted to younger workers, while software that screens and sorts resumes can winnow applicants by dates in their work or education history. More needs to be done to ensure a level playing field and put to rest tropes about older workers' abilities. When it comes to tech, Gen Xers in their early 50s may not be digital natives, but they've been using workplace technology their entire adult lives, and younger boomers aren't far behind. In addition, research shows that experienced workers bring valuable skills, professionalism, and a strong work ethic to the job. Our speakers today will share their insights about what's driving long-term unemployment and the kinds of policies and programs that can help job seekers find positions. First up, we'll hear from David Altig, Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, in conversation with AARP's Senior Vice President for Programs, Jean Setzfend.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for those remarks. All right, David, thank you so much for your time today. We're so delighted to have this opportunity to chat with you. First and foremost, we just heard a little bit about your intro and your background, and want to delve a little bit deeper into the Fed's background on this issue of workforce. We know the Fed is obviously so interested in the interest rates, inflation, but when it comes to workforce, a really critical component of the economy, love to hear a little bit more about the Fed's work in this area.
Sure, and thanks for inviting me to join you here. It's a pleasure to have the chance to chat with you. It is the case that even in monetary policy, the Federal Reserve has a mandate to pursue the objective of maximum employment. And maximum employment is obviously a very, very broad goal, one that Congress has determined the Federal Reserve has to take an interest in. It is, in fact, part of our charter. Now, it is the case that there isn't, there are limits to how much monetary interest rate policy, for example, can do to affect things. But what people probably don't know is that the Federal Reserve System has a very extensive community development function. We are mandated in that function to address issues, particularly issues related to low and moderate income populations and communities. And workforce development is sort of front and center in that element of community development. So it is basically through the angle of our mandate that we take an interest in workforce development issues and have rather robust workforce development initiatives.
That's terrific. Well, fortunate for us that we have another resource to rely on, because I think when we look at where we are today, especially in COVID recovery, I think one of the things that we're seized of at AARP is this whole issue of long-term unemployment, because so many in that population, unfortunately, are older workers. So relying on another area of expertise of the Fed, you guys are truly experts around numbers and research. So what are you seeing? What do you see? What's going on right now with the long-term unemployed? What do the numbers tell us? And are there sort of differences that you can attribute to different segments of the population? Is it broken down by age, different communities, race, age? Love to hear some more about that.
Yeah, so it is the case that long-term unemployment in the U.S. economy is disproportionately concentrated in workers or individuals who are age 55 plus. And there are always big jumps in those rates around the time of recessions. This time is obviously no different. But if you look at kind of populations who have higher unemployment rates generally, minorities, for example, they disproportionately get hit by recessions. Older workers are hit harder this time, just as they always are. So to give you sort of a notion of what the numbers look like, long-term unemployment overall is about 40% or so of total unemployment. But if you look at workers age 55 plus, that number gets up into the mid to high 50s. So it's very clear that this is an issue that is magnified. It's an issue for everyone, but it's an issue that's magnified for kind of older workers.
And I think with what we're seeing now too, as people are less prepared for retirement, work is an important component of this. So it's unfortunately a double whammy, I think, for older individuals, isn't it?
It is. And it's a double whammy because this was an issue that was front and forward in the financial crisis and the recession that followed that, as the financial conditions of a lot of people fairly late in their working careers was significantly damaged. We were sort of working our way through that when, of course, the pandemic hit and created a whole new set of challenges of somewhat of a different character, but one challenge on top of another. And that's been sort of the theme of the last 15 years, really, which is kind of one thing after another that's making life very challenging, and particularly life challenging for individuals who don't have a lot of time to adjust to these sorts of dislocations.
Absolutely. And I think bringing up the last Great Recession compared to this one, I guess the good news that we're hearing from some of the economic experts is that the time of recession, what's officially called a recession, seems like it's relatively condensed. But what can we learn from the last Great Recession? What does history tell us? That's similar or different?
Well, in some ways it's similar, because I already sort of made note of the fact that the long-term unemployment picture, for example, looks for older workers in particular, for minorities in particular. These are the groups that always get hit. And this time was really no different. Obviously, the nature of this one is very, very much different. The types of workers, for example, that were the most affected is much different this time around than it was in the Great Recession. The Great Recession mainly hit people in manufacturing and construction. As we know, there was sort of a big housing collapse, so that makes, that's not very surprising. This time around, because of the nature of the cause of the recession, and in particular, sort of the shutdown of a lot of face-to-face economic activity, would be kind of people in the service sector, leisure and hospitality, which were disproportionately affected. This time around, the interesting and vexing thing really about this comparison is that those jobs that were lost in manufacturing and construction sectors in the financial crisis and the Great Recession that accompanied it, those jobs never came back. So we were still very much challenged and working through the need to shift people to jobs that are available when the pandemic hit. And what the pandemic did was it created a whole new set of problems and a whole new set of challenges for a different group of people. Without having really gone through the process completely of solving the last problem we inherited from a downturn. So again, it's sort of piling one issue on top of another, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a really interesting point here. It's felt differently across various industries, but as we're trying to solve for the last Great Recession, we haven't really recovered from that, entering into another. Are there some sort of overall implications that you're seeing for the segment of this, the long-term unemployed, either as individual job seekers or collectively as a whole?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're in long-term unemployment, there are the consequences of sort of transitioning from kind of normal spells of unemployment, if you will. I don't know if I ever want to call them normal exactly, but most spells of unemployment are relatively short-lived. I mean, you lose a position one place and then you find another, and the long-term unemployed are going to be individuals who are faced with the problem of increasingly difficult circumstances in finding jobs. Their data is really pretty clear that the longer you are in a spell of unemployment, the harder it gets to find a new job. This time around, there's no reason whatsoever to think it's really going to be any different. So having gone through the stress of an extended spell of unemployment is bad enough, but what makes it even worse is the prospects of moving into employment once again are very clearly damaged by long-term spells.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a little disheartening for us at AARP because based on the surveys that we fielded ourselves, we know that the issue of age discrimination is very much real, either observed in the current workplace or older workers starting at the age of 45, unfortunately, have reported up to the tune of 70% of our survey respondents tell us that age, unfortunately, is a key limitation to getting a new job. So I think what you are saying is the extent to it, to the timeline getting longer makes it that much harder. So let's move away from the challenges and look to the solutions. So paint a bright picture for us. What's promising out there? What policies can be employed or programs to try to limit this issue of long-term unemployed?
Yeah, so I do think there's reason to be optimistic, and that takes a couple different. There's a couple different reasons for that. One is that the labor market is tight in a certain sense. There are lots of jobs and not enough people apparently right now to fill them. So there is opportunity, and frankly, when employers feel the stress of needing workers that they're having a hard time attracting, they get more creative, they get more assertive and active and looking for channels to kind of get workers that maybe they would not have considered when there's a labor surplus. And one of the clear things about this downturn is that stress on employers to fill jobs is much bigger than it was in the financial crisis. Another bright spot I really think is that these issues of inequality, these issues of imbalances in labor markets, and really the rapidly changing landscape for jobs brought about by information technology and the digital economy, the increasing focus on the provision of healthcare and the demand for that among consumers has really ramped up in fairly recent years. The efforts to retrain people, to skill people, to provide the kind of human capital opportunities that people can exploit to move into employment. The third thing I would kind of note, which is not programmatic, but cultural maybe, if you will, is that one thing that the pandemic has taught people, as we've all, or many of us, not all of us, but many of us have gone remote, not had the opportunity to roam the halls and, you know, shake people's hands and all the things we typically do at work. I think employers have begun to discover the importance of culture. And the importance of having people around with experience, having some diversity in sort of the demographic along lots of dimensions of your workers. So maybe this will be more appreciated than it was in the past, as both employers and employees have sort of discovered the value of someone who can sort of hand down some wisdom that you have. It's awfully hard to get any other way than to have the people who have been around and have experience in the labor force. Perfect. So I guess I would say those three things together, I think, are a recipe for some optimism and a positive path forward.
Wonderful. Well, you've laid it out so clearly for us, both in terms of the research, the stats that show us that the long-term unemployed is definitely an area of focus for us. And as we move to the next set of panels, we'll learn a little bit more about the research policies and programs to delve deeper into this issue. Thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, huge thanks to Jane and David for that conversation. We're excited to bring in the first panel discussion. And the first panel is really focused on understanding and unpacking data related to the long-term unemployed. And it's going to be moderated by Jane Oates, who's the president of Working Nation. Jane Oates, who is the president of Working Nation, is a former U.S. Department of Labor official who has played a key role in Working Nation's mission to raise awareness about the challenges facing the American workforce. Joining Jane in the panel is Valerie Wilson, who is the director of the Economic Policy Institute program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. Also be joined by Teresa Ghilarducci, who is the Irene and Bernard L. Schwartz Professor of Economics and Policy Analysis at the New School. Also be joined by Annalise Goger, who is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. With that, it's my pleasure to hand the conversation over to Jane. Jane, take it away.
Brett, thank you so much. And ladies, I want to get started right away on what Nancy and David both referenced, and that's the lessons that we could learn from the Great Recession and past economic downturns. And maybe because of your unique expertise, each of you could get into some of the specific policies that we think would really benefit the long-term unemployed.
I'll start. I hit the button. We found something really different in the Great Recession, the last one, and that followed through with this last weird recession. Let's just call this the weird COVID recession, because that was, imposed. But in both of those, we saw two things: that older workers were not as privileged in the labor market in terms of employers' decision to keep them on or to rehire them. In the past, we saw that older workers, with their experience and their connection to the job, perhaps because they were in unions and had seniority provisions, more protection, that they were sort of the last to go and the first to be rehired, the kind of FIFO. Now we're seeing sort of, last in, first out. We're seeing that older workers are first out and they're being employers are reluctant to rehire them. Perhaps it was a once in a lifetime chance to get rid of your older workers because there hadn't been enforcement of worker protection or age discrimination, during the Trump administration. We don't think it was that that employers were afraid of older workers because of their vulnerability to COVID, nor do we see any evidence that it was older workers not wanting to work because of COVID. They may not have been able to hop back in because of caregiving, but it's not coming from the supply side. We also didn't see that the states that cut off older workers and cut off all workers with unemployment benefits got a big resurge of people out of unemployment back into the labor force. No difference at all. So we don't see any evidence that unemployment benefits cause people not to work longer. So we're seeing overall a decline in the returns to experience, that whatever's happening in the labor market, it's not that favorable to older workers in general. Last thing, we saw it last time, and there was an Academy Award winning movie, No Man's Land, that actually told us about a slice of older workers that were hard hit by the last recession. Jane, you asked me about the last recession. I think we're going to have another Academy Award winning movie about what happened to older workers in this recession, but it's going to be called The Tale of Two Retirements, the tale of two experiences. People might have thought that older workers retired sooner because their stock market gains were so high and because they were afraid of COVID. And what we saw is that the privileged, the college educated, delayed their retirement. Perhaps they found that they could work longer, more because they didn't have to commute or because their 401k plans were increasing because they had them. What I'm really worried about is half of the workers in the older workers who were pushed into long-term unemployment and then just pushed out. They will be collecting Social Security benefits earlier. They will go without health insurance. They will come onto Medicare with much higher morbidity rates and much higher costs. So I could tell you when it's my turn what policies we recommend.
Okay. Annalise, Valerie, something to add there?
Sure, I'll add that I think probably the biggest lesson that we learned from the Great Recession is that the magnitude of our policy response to that must be proportionate to the crisis. Anything less than that limits the recovery, both in terms of the speed of the recovery, as well as in terms of who is able to benefit from that recovery and when. And in order to have an inclusive and equitable recovery, we have to first understand the needs of the people most likely to be left behind or most likely to take longer to get to a recovery, and then center those needs as we're developing our policies in response to that. Just real quick, contrasting the Great Recession with this COVID recession. In the Great Recession, older workers were less likely to become unemployed than younger workers, but took longer to find a job. Fast forward to where we are now, older workers had much greater job losses and still are facing the challenge of taking longer to reconnect to a job. And so we sort of have a magnified effect this time than we had before. So as we think about things that we need to do to have in place, I think first and foremost, it's important that we have a well-functioning unemployment insurance system, just because of the magnitude of job losses this time. And that the expiration of the expanded benefits be connected to measurable and reliable indicators of labor market recovery that we can observe across these different communities that have a differential impact from the recession, as opposed to arbitrary dates. And then another thing I think we should keep in mind as we're looking towards the future, particularly for older workers, it seems like the most important thing to do is to avoid that separation from a job at the beginning because of this prolonged search. So we should think about opportunities for work sharing policies that can work in conjunction with unemployment insurance so that we can avoid a complete separation of work for as many workers as possible.
Valerie, we're going to come back to that who and when in terms of the recovery, because I think that's something we're all going to be watching. You all, the three of you as labor economists more than anybody else. But Annalise, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on this question.
Thank you so much. Yes, I really think the points they raised were excellent. But one thing I've learned from the Great Recession, actually through some food security research I did, was that in 2015, we had more older Americans who were food insecure than we did during the Great Recession. So over the recovery period, more older Americans became food insecure. And so what I think, I mean, this kind of emphasizes what Teresa was saying about the tale of different retirements, tale of different experiences. We see huge racial and gender disparities in who is living at around like 100% of the poverty line or at 200% of the poverty line. And so we have to think about the safety nets that we provide older Americans. You have to think pretty holistically about it. That's my first point. When someone loses their job, so there's access to food assistance, there's access to health insurance, which is a bigger concern for older Americans because they tend to have more chronic health conditions. And then there's also access to affordable housing. There are all these multiple concerns. And right now, the way that we've set up our safety net is that you have to basically individually apply to each of these different programs. And it's super confusing for people. So I recently published a report on how we could transform our labor and education systems through digital transformation, where we emphasize user experience. And I think we should think about the older Americans and their different use cases in terms of how they often have multiple needs when they face a crisis or when they're displaced. In our research on food security, we interviewed over 193 low-income seniors over age 60. And one of the things that really struck me is just how, we have made a lot of our systems online. All the information's online, all the applications are online, and it's really hard to get that one-on-one help to reach a program. And whether it's housing, whether it's food, whatever it is, unemployment insurance, if we don't make one-on-one assistance more available, we're actually making it disproportionately impacting older Americans and the information they're able to access about the labor market, to get another job, but also about all these other forms of support that they might be eligible for. So those are some of the things I think, it's really critical to think about the user experience from a holistic point of view.
Such a good point. And I just want to take a second to say these three accomplished labor economists have done lots of research, and you can visit EPI, you can visit Brookings, and you can visit the New School to really look at their research, because 30 minutes doesn't give us enough time to adequately talk about the amazing work that they have done and continue to do. And with that PSA over, I go back to you, Teresa, and let's talk for a second, because I see there's some questions in the chat too that have brought up how, that tale of two retirements that you so eloquently framed. But what the question was, how do we differentiate between people who just said, oh, well, I was going to retire next year, I'm just going to retire now? With those, how do we differentiate them from those people who are really struggling to get back to work?
Yeah, no, we looked at the people who told the government surveyor, oh, I'm retired. But then we looked at their income and we thought, oh, you're retired so that you will be in poverty. Not believable. Retirement, telling researchers you're retired, is a polite and dignified way to say I was pushed out, I don't have hope. So we have always been, right, Annalise and Valerie, very suspicious of that moniker retired. Often it means long-term unemployed and I really need a job. Our policies have really crystallized around four areas that I hope that I can just take some time to discuss because of our research. And we are proposing a way to solve this problem in a structural way, a coordinated way for the federal government. And we'll see legislation on this soon. So our policies are: one, raise wages for older workers, because we have what we think is cutting edge research to show everybody, the world, Social Security is not acting the way we think it does. Almost all older workers are collecting Social Security while they're working. They're not like deciding to work, then retire, and then collect their Social Security at maybe a higher rate because they delayed retiring. They are collecting Social Security almost as soon as they can while they're working because wages are so low. And we test that by looking to see if they're collecting Social Security to kind of live it up, or are they collecting Social Security, to keep their incomes, above the poverty line? And every way we cut it, we are finding they're using Social Security as an earned income supplement. That means wages for older workers are just too low. Also, older workers are not eligible for any meaningful earned income tax credit. Even though that's the big subsidies for low income workers, you can have an older woman taking care of older people and a younger woman taking care of older people in the personal care and home health care market, but they have very different incomes just because the younger woman with children have access to more income. So it's unfair pay and very low pay. Raise wages. I have a proposal to actually add low-income workers who aren't in a pension plan to the thrift savings plan for all. The PSA is the Economic Innovation Group is collecting data on that proposal. The other thing that we may consider is lowering the age of Medicare and making it first payer. Age discrimination is rampant because of bigotry, but it also may mean that employers are fussing about employing older workers because their health insurance costs can be quite higher. The experience rate of a health insurer could say, hey, you have an older workforce, they're going to cost you more for health insurance. So if we made Medicare the first payer insurance for a 50-year-old worker, the employer would only have to provide the amount of money for a supplemental plan. That could really encourage older employers to hire older workers. The other thing that we suggest is actually raise unemployment benefits and extend long-term unemployment benefits to older workers. Rich Johnson at the Urban Institute said we never wanted to change unemployment to add an age aspect to it, but the numbers of how hard it is for older workers to go back to work may justify that. And the last thing is that we need an older workers bureau in the Department of Labor. Just like we had a women's bureau in 1919 because women had special needs and were in the labor market for good. We need to have an older workers bureau to collect data and coordinate all the different older worker programs in the Department of Agriculture and the Department of wherever, to really get the Social Security people to understand the idea that people delay work and then delay Social Security is a kind of reward for delay. It's just a fantasy. The Social Security Administration needs to know about the labor market, and they don't talk. So we need an older workers bureau to coordinate data on this problem and to coordinate solutions for Congress and the president.
Valerie, now you brought up earlier some changes you thought needed to be made to the UI system. Let me ask you to expand on that because I know Teresa just brought up some very interesting concepts for UI.
So I think first it's important to understand the UI system not as a disincentive to work as it is often being framed, especially in the context of a labor shortage, but just how critical those benefits are. And Teresa also cited that based on the evidence, there is no clear evidence that those states that cut their benefits early are seeing a hiring boom of any kind. We saw the same results coming out of the Great Recession. So that decision is just inflicting pain on people who need those benefits to stay afloat and to assist in their job search efforts. UI benefits are one of the most efficient sources of support during an economic crisis, both for individual workers, for their families, and for the economy, because they are highly targeted at those who experience an income shock due to the job loss, and they also help to stabilize aggregate demand. So we should be thinking about ways to strengthen and improve the program. And I think that includes making the expanded access that was available in this time, including self-employed and independent contractors, which are also disproportionately older workers, that those are things that should become permanent, in addition to simplifying the process. Annalise spoke about how complicated it can be to apply for any number of our social service programs, and that applies to unemployment insurance as well, from the application process and the fact that there are 50 different rules for how you do that, as well as the time that it takes to get a receipt of benefits. So both making sure that it's expansive so that it includes as many different kinds of workers as our economy changes, but also the process of doing that should reflect the value and the importance of those benefits for workers, their families, and the economy.
Yes, and let's start by modernizing the tech in our state at the state level. So ridiculous that we don't have interoperability there. Annalise, what else are we forgetting here?
Yeah, I would agree with Valerie there 100% that, first of all, why don't we just automate it so that people don't have to apply for UI benefits? Employers can just report it, and then it triggers the eligibility process, and that would go much faster. It would make the administrative burden would come off of the states, and so they could focus a lot more on maybe just assisting the employers directly. I think Valerie also raised a really important point earlier about work share, which is preventing the layoffs in the first place. And one of the things that could really help there is to invest a lot more in incumbent worker training or staff development, right? So you don't just fire people in a crisis so that you can then hire a new worker and train them up. There's actually quite a lot of value that older workers, more experienced workers bring to any company, especially when you're talking about people who understand their industry, who understand the problems and the context in which they're trying to apply technical solutions or other kinds of solutions. We could be really focusing on ongoing learning in the workplace itself, not waiting until people are unemployed to think about learning and training, but actually keeping people's skills up to date can help prevent layoffs in the future. I think that's something where we could focus a lot more policy attention.
Boy, that would be such a great idea. And I agree with you. I don't know why, 27 states won't even look at work share. But I want to, in addition to dealing with the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd brought inequity to the surface in a way that I don't think it has been brought to the surface in my lifetime. So I want to spend a few minutes with your expertise. How do we really make sure that the populations, obviously older workers, but Black, Latino, Asian workers, the disproportionate impact on them during this pandemic, how do we make sure that we have the systems in place to really address that, what I think has been discrimination in the past, not only against older workers, but also, workers of color and older workers of color? You add two of those together and it just gets worse. I don't know who wants to take a lead on that, but I know you all have something to say about it.
I'll do it really quickly. The older workers of color, we've been documenting that they are less likely to be able to ask their employers. They feel less likely to ask their employers for accommodation. So obviously, something about the American with Disabilities Act has to actually be broader, that all workers who need accommodation should feel free to do it and be protected there. We also are finding that they need to feel safe, so that the public health systems really have to work with employers to get the vaccine on the job. That would have really helped healthcare workers, and would have really helped the low-income workers. So public health and employers were really disconnected in this pandemic, and you can see it in the communities. We still have vaccination rates, and they just need some bargaining power. Bargaining power if they had a pension. That could give them a little more bold to ask for accommodation or to ask for training. Higher wages, so that if they lost one job and they went to another, they could actually ask for a better deal. So we did an impact study on what raising the minimum wage, national minimum wage to 15 would do, and it would disproportionately help older workers compared to prime age workers.
Well, that's another reason to be for that policy.
Yep.
Annalise, Valerie?
Yeah, I want to talk about discrimination. So if you're thinking, so there is a lot of evidence that many forms of discrimination and multiple can affect people in the labor market. So if you add age discrimination to racial discrimination to gender discrimination to criminal record discrimination, all these things are multiply out. And so I think we need to really think about how to focus on more enforcement of anti-discrimination, more education of employers about, what types of misperceptions people might have, in terms of people who have a criminal record. You're basically dismissing people categorically because they have a record and not paying attention to what could they actually bring, what kind of value could they bring to your company, what are the types of experiences they could bring that might add, more potential for innovation or different market segments that you could reach. There's just a lot of categorical exclusion happening within the labor market. And I think we need to really think through that from a policy point of view moving forward and how to overcome some of these stigmas and sort of increase the possibility that people have more options to interact face-to-face with people instead of just seeing them as a category, but really get proximate to the population and understand that, there's a wide diversity of people underneath these big categories. And we should be looking beyond just those superficial qualities.
Absolutely. Valerie?
So I'm going to go back to something I said at the beginning. And I think that one of the most important things we can do is make sure that we have a robust and inclusive recovery, simply because we know that the potential for discrimination is greater when there are higher rates of unemployment. Truly a tighter labor market is important to reducing those disparities, both in employment, but also in terms of wages. I also would like to piggyback off of a point Teresa made about bargaining power and how important that is, that people have alternatives and are able to make the decision that's truly best for them, as opposed to a decision that is motivated by desperation or just need to get back to work. So the kinds of income supports that we've been discussing today are important for empowering workers to be able to find a good match or to take the time they may need to get some additional skilling or training that, again, is only effective if there are jobs for people to go into in the first place. And then we really have to consider how the structures of our economy and the labor market contribute to these disparities and occupational segregation in particular, as it relates to women of color being concentrated in the care industry in particular. We need to think about ways that, and I'm encouraged that the Biden administration seems to be giving some attention to this idea. It's care being part of a broader definition of infrastructure, and how we can make those jobs better paying jobs with better benefits and better worker protection. Then the final thing I will say is the importance of aid to state and local governments. In being important because we want to prevent a similar kind of public sector contraction that we experienced during the Great Recession, which also slowed the recovery. Government was the second highest job loss industry between February 2020 and February 21. And the average public sector worker tends to be an older worker, more highly educated, but also more likely to be women and people of color, and experience smaller racial wage gaps and gender wage gaps in the public sector compared to the private sector. So thinking about the industries that we want to target in terms of improving working conditions there, making sure that those jobs are available, and most importantly, I think, is that workers have some bargaining power and some leverage to get a good job, a job that's really best for their entire well-being.
Yeah, that idea of job quality is one that we didn't hear and we haven't heard enough about, and I hope it never goes away, which leads me to a question. The pandemic was a nightmare, and we never want to go through it again once it finally ends. But what are some things that either happened during the pandemic or that we've learned in dealing with the pandemic that you think will influence your work and policy work really going forward?
Yeah, great question. Inequality. I will always cut the data by two measures. One, actually education. This class dimension, the socioeconomic status connection really mattered. I will always now look at what's happening to this big growth sector on personal care and home health care, and I will measure the non-paid care. That will always be part of what we do. We are also measuring what we call in-house kind of U7, which are all these older workers who tell surveyors that they've been out of work for more than 27 weeks, but they still would like a job. This is another whole reserve army of labor, that we are not paying attention to. I will always put front and center, how many new jobs created do we expect to be filled by older workers who need to be filled by older workers? And the number now is over half. We are projecting about 11 million more jobs and net jobs being added to the US economy in the next 10 years. We expect over 6 million of that 11 million will be filled by workers over 55. I will really pay attention to older workers by race, because older workers are really pigeonholed by race in occupations. So we could really see a lot of industry and occupational level policies that may bring up the bottom quite a bit. So I will always be looking at looking at this work through the inequality range. The one thing we forgot to mention, everybody, is how important paid sick leave is. The pandemic showed us that we need to get sick people to stay home, not just with COVID, but with our flu. No longer will I go into a staff meeting and hack my way through it and expect to be viewed as a hero. And there were many people who aren't even getting vaccinated because they fear they might be sick for a day or two, and they can't afford time off work. Those are the things that we will start to measure. That was a long list, Jane.
No, that's a good list. Valerie, Annalise, what would you add?
So I think, yeah, that was a really comprehensive list. And what I would say is that I think what we should learn from this time is that going into any economic downturn, we should place close attention to how the crisis stratifies the workforce, depending on what has happened. In this pandemic, we basically saw three groups. People who outright lost their jobs, tens of millions of people, that always happens in a recession. But then we had a group of workers who maintained their jobs, but because they had to continue going to work in person during the crisis, they faced greater health risks. And then we had a group that was likely to be able to continue to work remotely. So they had economic security and health security at the same time. And when we look across different demographic groups, we know that lower wage workers, people of color, women, and even older workers were least likely to be in that last group. And so that really should be where we start. How does this crisis affect different communities, and where do we need to really target our efforts to get things back on track?
Thank you. Annalise, last word.
Sure. For me, the thing that the pandemic has highlighted is how we really need to do a reset on our basic infrastructure for our safety nets, because this pandemic affected a lot of low wage workers, a lot of people in hospitality, and those jobs in gig work, freelancers, musicians. These are exactly the people that the safety net was not built to protect. And so what did we have to do in response? Well, Congress had to pass the CARES Act to create 3 new programs in the middle of a crisis when millions of people are already hitting the system. And so how to make a response worse? Add new things in the middle of a chaotic environment. And so I think we need to think through, okay, what is a safety net for, and why aren't we covering everyone? Why do we need to invent new things when it should be triggered, it should be automatic, and it should be treating different categories of workers more equally. And I think that is very historical. It goes way back into how we decided who to cover and how to be eligible and who's deserving. Some really philosophical questions about who's deserving of protection. But I think, to me, that's the biggest insight is we need to really revisit some of those things. And maybe it's a good historical opportunity to make our labor market systems more equitable in terms of our response.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, three amazing economists. Thank you for your presentations today, your participation in this discussion, but thank you for your amazing work. And with that, I hope you're hearing the virtual applause. With that, I hand it back to Rhett. Thank you, Rhett.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to our amazing panel. Our next panel is going to focus on innovative solutions to support the long-term unemployed and how organizations can collaborate to support this population. We're so pleased that today's panel is going to be moderated by Lisa Marsh Ryerson. Lisa is the president of the AARP Foundation, and she's joined by an amazing panel of experts from all across the country. First is Wendy Copeland, who's the Chief Strategic Partnership and Activation Officer for Goodwill Industries. Also joined by Andy Clune, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the National Skills Coalition, Tracy Scott, who's the Vice President of Workforce Development at the National Urban League, and Jason Tushko, who's the Vice President for Center for Education Workforce for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. With that, it's my pleasure to hand the panel over to Lisa. Lisa, take it away.
Thanks so much, Rhett, and welcome to Jason and Tracy and Andy and Wendy. I'm so excited to be talking with you today. Wow, what an excellent first panel and opening fireside chat and remarks, and I'm seeing some nods. It was another reminder, the first panel, that we have to move from evidence, right, in any recovery, both quantitative and qualitative evidence. And I think for me, a reminder in our discussion that we're actually talking about recovery from a convergence of pandemics. For sure, COVID-19, economic downturn, and the ongoing pandemic of systemic racism and discrimination. And I think another thread that I hope we carry through in our conversation is that there are multiple identities for the older worker. And we know that individuals seem to be left behind, crisis after economic crisis, throughout history. So when we add age in as another identity lens, we also have to think about the intersectionality of identities. And I think finally, I hope what frames our conversation is something that Valerie said, which is so important. And in essence, you get what you're designed to get. So as she was commenting on designing for a robust, inclusive recovery, which was another reminder to me that you cannot build inclusion or equity in after the fact. We have to be thinking about equity and inclusion every step of the way. So with that said, let's jump in and get started. And I want to start with you, Tracy, and have you talk with us a bit about your experience at the National Urban League, about what you're doing to support workers, and then in particular, what you're doing to support through programs and other offerings, those who are long-term unemployed.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that question, and good afternoon, everyone who's joined us today. The National Urban League has always, jobs has been the heart of the National Urban League movement since its infancy. And so for us, we always have a wide range finger on the pulse of what's happening when it comes to jobs. Traditionally, individuals of color, particularly African-American, unemployment is always double that of their white counterparts. So that indicates, and that's just historically, so that gives us an indication that there is a bit of system racism built, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsically motivated itself. The way the first thing that the National Urban League does is first, let's call attention to this pervasive issue. Let us bring together individuals who are committed and have the ability and access to address those issues, to bring resources together to fight against it. The second bit is that the National Urban League is a community of 90 other local affiliates that work in our communities, who day to day, face to face, know what's happening and are part of the solution and bringing local partnerships together. And so a bit of that feedback that we've received as it relates to long-term unemployment, there's got to be good, comprehensive wraparound services. And that was a bit talked about in the previous panel. But it also needs to include, as we've learned, much broader support. So it's not just access to mental health, but it's got to be access to transportation. And there has to be payment or support for childcare. There has to be job training and job readiness. And then also other more behavioral health supports that we've learned, such as cognitive behavioral health. Individual, I believe it was David had mentioned at the outset that Individuals who are coming back to the workplace are not the same than when they left. And we cannot forget that emotional toll, being out of the workplace and how much of our identity is a part of it, but also the financial gap. And what does that mean? Especially if you're a person of color or you're a low income family, it is almost double, triple that stress that an individual who's looking for work. The final piece I will also mention is that reentry is an important piece that we often don't talk about, especially as it relates to older working Americans. If we cannot talk about the long-term unemployed and completely not lift up the people who have 2-3 times the strike against them, a barrier to do it. And so I'll stop there because I can certainly take up all the time, but I want to give it to my other panelists to add a more spice to the conversation.
Tracy, that's a wonderful beginning for us, and you're underscoring that, you know, helping people get back to work is really about whole person service. So it's about a good quality job, but it's also about ensuring people have enough income and connection to social supports and resources to meet the essential needs in their lives so they can thrive, which brings me to you, Wendy. I always enjoy hearing you talk about, this is really about offering older workers, long-term unemployed, but all people the opportunity to thrive as they age. And so that's certainly about the programs that you engage with in Goodwill. It's about the individual, but it's about community partnerships. So I thought, Wendy, it'd be helpful if you could speak a bit about what you know works with the best local community partnerships, or maybe some tips for how we move into a new era of strategic community partnerships.
Well, thank you, Lisa. And I'm just sitting here cheering Tracy, cheering Annalise, because we too believe that this is about a holistic, whole household approach that are essential for equitable career resiliency. And to do that, how do we build an ecosystem locally and through national networks like our own? You know, Goodwill is America's neighbor. We're within 10 miles of 82% of the population. And we are partnering with the likes of Indeed in creating virtual and hybrid and in-person hiring events so people can connect with opportunity, and building a partner page where if you come in through the Indeed Goodwill partner page, you get access to extra supports, someone to help you with your resume and give you individualized personal coaching that will help you move ahead. And really it is understanding that people get lost in transitions. Whether I'm a person who has experienced the impact of the criminal justice system, or I am a person who has been disconnected from work for a while, an older worker. If you look at the 1 million or more people we serve every year, we see a large percentage of older workers and younger workers. And what we see is that meeting people where they are is what makes the difference. And connecting people with partners with skills through Coursera, Google, and others, with internships, paid internships at Accenture, connecting people with those opportunities with employers who are ready to receive talent from somewhere they never expected, and make sure that people have the skills and the supports they need to compete in the market and be equitably compensated for that work and have access to equitable opportunities. Because what you said is right. We will never redesign for equity. We've got to start from whole cloth and design for the equity we must have in our community. A job is essential and insufficient. People may need a now job because we need a paycheck. I always had to work my way through school. And we also need support in building the skills for the next job in the career, even if my next career starts as I am now, almost 59.
Yeah, no, Wendy, I think such great build on to the way Tracy started us. But again, that building in agency and resiliency across jobs, across our lifespan, and across and within communities, which leads me, Jason, to you. Jump in. I think building effective partnerships is also about recognizing the different needs and expertise of various sectors. So as you're working at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, what are you hearing from the business community or from other organizations about what they're facing right now during the pandemic, and also how we might, as specialists in workforce development, be working more effectively with businesses across the nation.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think David hit it on the head earlier today when he was talking about the tightening of the labor market and how employers are trying to position themselves in it. You know, we know we're in an economy that competes on talent, and companies are becoming ever more sophisticated in terms of how they are not only developing systems and processes for how to upskill and reskill their incumbent workers, but how they can develop much more intentional partnerships in the community to build high-performing talent supply chains. And as we're engaging those members and thinking through how to access all the various skills and talent they need to compete successfully in today's economy, we are getting them to take a very comprehensive look at all the available talent development systems, as well as priority populations that they could be sourcing from. So a lot of this isn't about, you know, winning hearts and minds and good intentions, because we all have many of those things. A lot of what we've learned over probably the past almost a decade now was going inside and facilitating the change management that needs to happen top to bottom inside a company, across an industry, and then make that pervasive across a region is really what's needed. And that capacity building inside the private sector itself has been just woefully behind. And we have been trying to do our part to engage our members where they're at, where they do want to better articulate better hiring requirements that give them access to a larger talent pool. They do want to make sure that they have a workforce that is representative of the communities in which they live and the customers in which they serve. They do want to be able to design better jobs and reward workers for making a contribution towards their competitiveness, but they often don't know where to start and how to benchmark themselves relative to their peers. So a lot of this is at its core change management, because I can tell you that the companies we work with, they're dying on the vine for talent. And they are trying to figure out how to effectively reinvent their own processes for how they find, source, develop, and retain talent, including older workers and including the long-term unemployed. In many of the regions where we are engaging our members, they are in areas where there's a declining working age population, and that is a trend that will continue. So we're being asked to do more with less, and talent is a premium, and we need deep bench strength for every available worker to plug in if we're going to have the economic recovery we all want and need. And it's going to take a lot of changes on the business side, but we need to facilitate that change management and engage peer-to-peer practice and best practice sharing among them, so they can learn from one another and we can all improve together. So we get it, and we're trying to do our best to figure out how do we build better talent pipelines into the long-term unemployed, because if they are not part of our bench strength for our workforce system, we are going to have a lackluster economic recovery.
Yeah, Jason, excellent. And to me, it's a reminder. In essence, you're speaking about developing more viable shared value models. So you have businesses and organizations that have real needs to continue to drive their development and the health, not only of their organization, but of the communities that they serve. And we're talking about having so many people who've been locked out of opportunity for far too long, who can fill those jobs. And then how do we, as experts in the field, what's our role in translation or being sure that we're building those models effectively, as Jason is saying, which Andy is a perfect lead into you. Andy, I think you know, I was a college president for 2 decades. I have always talked about lifetime learning, but I really believe in it. I mean, there is no one degree or credential any of us can receive and expect that to serve us in total across our lifespan or the opportunities that we might have or might need. So Andy, if you could talk with us about what you're seeing in terms of best practices, but beyond that, what are some organizations doing that are really working if they're thinking about new training and learning opportunities for long-term unemployed or for incumbent workers? And how do we match that up with employer needs? And then I'm adding on to my question. And are there skill sets or areas that we just always have to address because they would be needed for individuals to move through the transitions that Tracy and Wendy were speaking about?
Good question. Thanks, Lisa. Well, let me follow up on some things that folks talked about in the earlier panel, which is we were talking a little bit about what's the challenge with our current unemployment system. And there are some parallels of what's the challenge with our current workforce and education systems, right? So our unemployment systems, and as we're talking about folks who are long-term unemployed, they really were structured with the assumption that people are having these temporary bouts with unemployment, right? It's kind of with the business cycle, right? And so when you have a structural thing that's happened, like in this past recession, where you have jobs that have been eliminated that are not coming back, and you have employers, to Jason's point, that are kind of looking at technology as a way to kind of, how do we deal with lower headcount because folks are not coming back? And now we're dramatically changing the digital and technology content of current jobs. So there's both jobs are going away, jobs that currently exist are changing significantly, such that the folks who want to get back into the labor market, maybe into the industry that they were employed before, the job that they had back in February 2020 is different than the job that they would be applying for today. I mean, those are some really structural challenges where just thinking about unemployment in terms of the business cycle is not the way that we should be approaching it. It's the same way with education. Like, we made a commitment as a country that we would educate folks to the age of 18, basically, right? And we would subsidize some folks to get some education, in their late teens and early 20s through college and whatever. But after that, you were pretty much on your own. And so we talk a lot about lifelong learning. We think it's something that everybody should do, but we as a nation do not invest in that. It's one of the reasons why we as a country, basically rank last in the industrial economies for what we spend on active labor market intervention, which is not just how we're educating people at the beginning of their careers, but how we're helping to educate them all along the way. And so that's where, the things that we have seen, to Jason's point, industry context means everything. And the partnerships that folks have talked about just on this panel now about how it is that you're bringing together local employers, labor unions and unionized sectors, community colleges, community organizations, workforce boards, workforce intermediaries, and getting them to figure out collectively, what is it that this industry needs now? What are the skills of the folks in our local community that we could and should be hiring? And then what are the investments that we could be making, both private investment as well as public investment, to get folks into jobs and then to help them advance over time? And I do think that, one of the things that we're seeing in this recession is folks have recognized that it's not going to be enough to get many people back to the job that they had back in February, February 2020. For one, that job doesn't exist, but also we want a lot of folks who are on the margins of the labor market, including those workers of color, folks without a BA, older workers who have not had an opportunity to train past high school. We want to get them into a better job. That's a long-term process. It means folks are going to have to move from company to company within their industry. And so we need to get everybody together and all the resources together to make that happen. And it's those industry partnerships that we see in healthcare and manufacturing and different parts of infrastructure, and even in retail and hospitality. That's where it is that we see the greatest successes. We should have policies that build those partnerships and help folks advance along a longer term career pathway.
I want others to jump in on this. I think, Andy, you're pulling together all of our earlier comments. You're talking about creating pathways to success with learning at the center, and having that, if I heard you accurately, that's a shared responsibility or should be a shared goal across sectors, whether it's my sector, the nonprofit sector, for-profit, government, other agencies and organizations in communities. And that's that would be a real shift. That would get back to designing something that might be totally new, because we tend to see upskilling, or in my experience, and retraining, to be too specific to what's right out in front. As opposed to building those skills that build resiliency across the life course. Who else? Tracy, Jason, Wendy, and Andy as well. What are you seeing now as maybe some interesting ideas or solutions that might be in innovation right now about around those learning or skilling pathways?
Sure, I can jump in. So there are, first, I'd like to uplift the National Urban League's Lewis Latimer plan. And why this is important is because we're seeing greater access through technology for upskilling, someone to take on their own to develop skills. But for particularly low income communities, there's no access to broadband. How can you have access to those classes? How can you look for work if you do not have access to the internet? The second part is what we call digital literacy. Many older Americans are uncomfortable with utilizing technology in their personal lives, or there are tools of technologies and advancements that they may not feel as proficient in. We need to add digital literacy and training as a part of career readiness or job readiness prior to entering into the workforce. We also might want to talk about how to orient individuals who are seeking jobs online. For example, we had an affiliate and they had virtual job fairs, but they recognized that a lot of the candidates didn't know the etiquettes of online interviews, of making sure you have adequate broadband or internet connection, making sure you're in a quiet space. So I think we have to think about very rudimentary access. And that's sort of like a step before we talk about system change and bringing individuals together. I also want to lift up the Long-Term Unemployment Elimination Act that's been bicamerally sponsored by Senators Van Hollen and Levine. And it's intentional to ensure that this conversation is no longer episodic, but rather it is a part of our entire public response to help those who are unemployed. Before I'll turn over the mic to Wendy, I would also like to talk about, we need in our training programs, we should have adult basic education refresher, particularly for older workers who haven't been in school for a very long time, who may not have, so going into technology or new skills. Math is now an important skill set that needs to be had. But how many of us have, how long has it been since any of us took trigonometry or algebra? And so sometimes we find that that can be a barrier. If we just have a refresher included into our programming, then that gives an additional boost for those that are looking for work.
Yeah. Or statistics, which is something people use in their jobs probably a little bit more. But I want to turn it to Wendy because but first, Tracy, to say you're right about all the digital divide. I think we have to talk about that. That is such at the core of so much as it relates to the disparity and access to economic opportunity. But many, many older adults are actually quite agile and willing to be using technology. It does land though on, do they have access to affordable broadband, to the hardware and tools that they need and ongoing education. And Wendy, I hope you talk about coaching, because coaching is part of education and a really important key to this conversation.
I love it that we're having mind meld. So Tracy, it's like, digital skills are table stakes now. And it's not just skills, it's broadband, it's devices. And the next part is your career navigator or your career coach has to have those skills too. And having the democratization of the data that you can access digitally that helps you make good choices about what is going to be that next credential or the next badge or the next skill or the assessment you're going to take that qualifies you for a job. I mean, having all of that available through career navigation, through career coaching, so that there is widely available access to the what works for people who want to get back to work. And as we are looking to build this, it is essential that we look at what people really need. What we're seeing, if people are showing up and say, I know, I need some skills, I do, like 70% of the folks, but I need a paycheck right now. And so how do we build, earn and learn in our systems so that, yes, it's working with employers. Hooray for those who are doing, college and other certifications, and they pay from day one, whether you're part-time or full-time, they pay 100%. That is fabulous. And it's also building it into the person's plan. What we have learned is that one page, my career plan, helps us move forward. And because it has the steps laid out and it deals with the stability that I need in my life, everything from housing to transportation to nutrition to child or other dependent care, but laying it all out, whole person, holistic, and having a plan. And that is something that a career navigator, a career coach makes all the difference. And that is something that can happen in the public system, in the private system, and frankly, in places of faith. We can build a system and folks, collaborations like the Rework America Alliance are working very carefully to try to build systems that are working with that. And Tracy, I know you work with that too.
Jason, I want you to jump in on this, and then and Andy as well. And then I want us to be thinking about, with all of the advice that we have, this was brought up also in the earlier panel, we know a lot, but how are we thoughtfully gaining insights from the older adults who are long-term unemployed or discouraged workers or incumbent workers who are not making enough right now? How do we ensure that we are addressing the actual root causes? But Jason, Andy, jump in now.
Yeah, just getting back to the earlier question, three things I would kind of call out where I think there's promise is one is around partnerships. And it's one thing to have these conversations, another thing to build the community infrastructure and supports to intentionally tackle the problem. And that requires an end-to-end solution where employers are there at the beginning, at the core, redesigning their talent sourcing strategies, their hiring requirements, the design of the job itself and the benefits it offers, thinking through all the potential issues that could arise that could lead to a lack of retention. But it takes hyper intentionality. And much like we're talking about, we need to redesign the safety net whole cloth. Well, if you're going to create scalable pathways to opportunity for the long-term unemployed, it's going to take a similar redesign effort in how employers think about talent sourcing, development, and supporting their incumbent workers. It can be done. We're seeing it happen all over the place, but it does require folks to opt in and intentionally say, we're going to work with employers to build these pipelines. We're not going to train and pray, but we're going to work with the demand side to organize those opportunities and the jobs for them, so people more easily and seamlessly access them or find the right networks to access them. So it's all about the local partnerships and building that support in the community and that capacity. But two other real quick things is we also need to speak to, like what Annalise was talking about earlier. This is a rare moment where we need to realize a lot of the decisions we're making is based on really bad quality data. We have major gaps in our data around what are the job opportunities, what are the in-demand jobs and skills, and even bigger gaps when it comes to getting some kind of analytics around employment outcomes. This is our moment where we can modernize America's workforce data infrastructure, and it can be done as a public-private partnership, which will give us more actionable analytics and data that will allow us to be more proactive as well as reactive when we have these incidents occur in our labor market. So we need to fix those systems. It goes beyond just UI. And then lastly, finance, how we think about how we finance and invest in talent. Think about all the finance instruments that are available to the long-term unemployed and older workers. There aren't a lot. Much of the system was front-loaded to get people early access. Like Andy was saying, we had a social contract that we said we're going to have people have these opportunities early in life to get up to a certain education level, and you're off to the races from there. But we realize that we are in a dynamic labor market with skill obsolescence, and we don't have a lot of instruments in place that help mid-career or older workers manage that skill obsolescence effectively outside of more traditional kind of tuition reimbursement programs. But maybe now is the time to think of things like skill savings accounts, where an employer could help you manage your skills over time, much like we help manage things like retirement and healthcare. It's just another piece of the mix, but we can't just try to repurpose an old tool. We need to reinvent what that benefit looks like and make it one where employers can have some skin in the game as well.
Well, we need more employees to have access to good jobs that have the variety of benefits and maybe some of these new ideas as well. I think Jason's really brought to the fore, and Andy, I want you to jump in on this, it being in your background. Evaluation is key. So we have to figure out, what we have to build the evaluation plans and what's the outcome we're going for. How do we test possible interventions and solutions? And if something isn't working, stop it and redeploy the resources, whether those are policy resources or advocacy resources or the resources we use in our own organizations to train people. Andy, can you kind of sum all of this up for us, this conversation on education and skills?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point that you made, Lisa, and Jason's prior point on data, absolutely. We want to make sure that we have the best information available to local employers and to local working folks about where it is that their future lies ahead. We want to do that for efficiency reasons. We want to do it for equity reasons as well. We want to know whether or not the people most impacted by this pandemic are the ones who are benefiting from investments that we're making in education and training and support services and all the things folks talked about. And I think too, we want to make sure that older workers in particular are not being discriminated against. It was not so long ago when we were having conversations with folks up on the Hill about trade adjustment assistance, which when manufacturing workers were losing their jobs because of trade pacts. And it was just considered like, we're not going to provide training to anybody over the age of 50 or 55. Why bother, right? That was kind of a general thought. We worked very actively against that. And I know that everybody who's participating in this event today would say that that doesn't make any sense. Folks are working well past their 60s in many cases. So we want to make sure that we're investing in older workers just the way we invest in an 18 or a 19-year-old to make sure they've got a pathway forward that works for them and works for local industry, and it's going to be better off in their community as well.
Yeah, right. You're right there, Eddie, because we all do better when we all do better, right? Individuals need opportunity across the lifespan. Flash round in our last 3 minutes. I'm going to start with Tracy. If you were our Secretary of Labor, what would you put in place to support the long-term unemployed?
So for long-term unemployed, one, I would be eagerly awaiting the outcome of Senator Van Hollen's the Long-Term Unemployment Elimination Act, because that will target specifically the community that we are talking about. Two, I really love Teresa's mention in the previous panel of having having a separate agency within the Department of Labor looking at the aging workforce itself, because there are interventions that are very unique to this population, and the fact that we're going to see an increase in the workforce and aging workforce itself. Yes. We need to be responding now.
Got it. All right, flash round. Wendy.
Qualify people who have experienced long-term unemployment for continued training dollars and supports after they've gotten a job. My now job may not be where I'm going, but I need it now for the paycheck. Don't stop the supports when I go to work.
Got it. Jason.
Yeah, I would, it hasn't been too much of a discussion today, but I think if you had to do something immediately, looking at ways to provide subsidized employment and training wages, particularly for priority populations, is a great way to provide an immediate benefit to companies who are trying to control for payroll, but could definitely make sure a population gets access to that job so they can get some learning done on the job and reach full productivity.
The way to expand CSEP to involve other organizations. That's great. And Andy, last word.
Let's work to make sure folks don't lose their jobs. Let's invest in people now while they're on the job. Let's make that a feature of our workforce system, not a bug. And let's recognize that the Department of Labor can't solve it all on their own. We need HHS, commerce, education, ag, all the services we talked about. We need everybody on board working together to make sure we have a comprehensive strategy for America's working people.
Great. Thank you all. If you could see it, there are great comments in the chat and applause. What a treat to be with you. I'm going to turn it back to Rhett and Stuart and Susan. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for masterful skills organizing the panel there. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of our panelists for laying out the situation for us and beginning to turf up some amazing solutions. Believe it or not, we are at the end of our time together. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to invite Susan and Stuart back into the conversation for some brief closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up. So Susan, we'll start with you.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. These panels have been so amazing. It's the insights that I've heard about an older workers bureau, comprehensive services, interest in people while they're on the job to continue to have them trained, lifelong learning, and the interest in the U.S. and actually making sure that's actually happening and supporting that kind of work. I mean, the list is long and my notes are over a page long of different ideas and solutions. So this is fantastic. So let me again just thank the Atlanta Fed for working with us on this. It's been a wonderful experience. And also to Colin Danley and Rhett Buttle from Public-Private Strategies, amazing work. And thank you all so very much.
I don't have a lot to add to that. I learned a ton. And I would highlight our last group of people, which is you all, the attendees today. We've had over 75 comments, ideas, questions just on the Zoom platform. I know that there's been more on Facebook, and think of today as a beginning for that. We're going to be going through all of that information, learning more from it, following up and continuing the conversation. So thank you to you all for coming. Thank you to Public-Private Strategies, to the AARP. We're excited for this. And thank you to all of our panelists.
Awesome. Well, let me add my thanks as well to our panelists, to our moderators, to our audience, and for today's amazing conversation. As a reminder, this is the beginning of a conversation. We're hoping to have more coming to you from AARP and the Fed. And just thank you all so much for joining us today. We know a lot of folks have asked about how you can access this information. We are going to put some information up on all the organization's websites. This will also be available on Facebook streaming, and we are going to make sure that everyone who signed up for today's event also receives a copy of the recording. With that, our huge thanks. Everyone have an amazing day, and this is now the end of the program. We'll see you soon.